Good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining us. Thanks to the gentleman on board here and to all the subscribers. We have an enormous amount of you out there, so I think you're in for a terrific evening. I'm Leslie Visser, and I had the privilege of writing for the Globe for 13 years. I started in the summer of 1974 on a Carnegie Foundation grant, and I think I've written for every one of the guys here, but really two of them, along with Tom Mulvoy, who's not here tonight, but they really shaped my career, really got me started, and a long, lengthy career at the Globe. And they made me the first woman to cover the NFL as a beat. And all of you watching could imagine what it was like to write for the Globe in those days with those rock stars. I would go to Wimbledon. I'd say, hi, I'm Leslie Visser from the Boston Globe. I work with Bud Collins. And everyone, Rod Laver or Illy Nastasi, oh, really? What do you need? I'd go to the World Series with Peter. Oh, really, Peter? Come in the manager's office. Same with Bob at the NBA Finals. And probably most of all, the late, great Will McDonough. You all know Will McDonough. Everyone has stories. I remember in 1979, Will and I were at a Giants game, freezing in the Meadowlands, and Will, out the side of his mouth, looked across the field and he said, see that guy over there, that assistant? Get to know him. He's going to be good. It was Bill Belichick. So I introduce you to all the men who've made this happen for the past 50 years. The Boston Globe Sports is the place that every writer wants to be. So we're going to welcome Dave Smith, Vince Doria, Don Squire, Joe Sullivan, and Matt Pepin, who's the current sports editor, and he's the guy who put all this together. So thank you for that, Matt. Dave, first to you, can you talk a little bit about why you came to the Globe, how many years you were there, kind of what your vision of the paper was going to be and what you're doing now?
Well, what I'm doing now is the most difficult thing I've ever done, which is try to get my handicap loan. Now I'm retired, still living. I'm living in Frisco, enjoying life very much. I went to the Globe in 1970 and was there from 70 to 78. I arrived at the Globe when the Globe was making a very strong decision to focus on sports, realizing that the one equalizer in the whole community and in the country is sports. Sports kind of takes the mind off of all the other problems in the world. In fact, I remember once somebody told me that when the times are really economically tough in our country, one of the things that draws most interest is wrestling. And I don't understand that one, but anyway, I was fortunate to be there in the 70s to see the Red Sox World Series against Cincinnati, one of the greatest World Series of all time. I watched the Bruins, Celtics win championships. Ironically, at the time, the Bruins, you couldn't get a ticket. You couldn't buy a season ticket. You had to inherit the tickets. The Celtics, on the other hand, winning championships, and you could walk up at game time and get a good seat. That was the difference at that time. The Red Sox were still the dominant force in the city. And they say that during the busing crisis that Boston was involved in the mid-70s, that the Red Sox happened to be in the pennant race that summer, and that probably saved the city from very, very severe problems as far as riots and so forth. I also had the fortune to watch the Patriots become the Patriots. The original owner, to show you how things are today, today, to get to an owner of a professional sports team, I mean, you have to beg, borrow, and jump through hoops to even get a chance to talk to him. Well, back then, Billy Sullivan, who owned the Patriots, delivered our press tickets to my office in person, and brought a little press release himself asking us to run something in the paper. That's how bad it was. But we watched them go from Harvard to Foxborough and become a legitimate team. One of the interesting things too during our time, during the 70s, was there was a group of independent college football teams. There was Boston College and Syracuse and Pittsburgh and Penn State, and I think it was West Virginia, all independents. And so Ernie Roberts and I came up with the idea of, since they weren't in any conference or anything, so we created a conference. At the time we called it the East Indies, and we kept standings and kept statistics in the paper, and that kind of set the tone for the Big East eventually. But it was a great time. I left the Globe in '78, went to the Washington Star, put that one out of business, and then went to the Dallas Morning News, where I was there for the last 25 years before retiring in 2004, and that's enough about me.
Well, you've been iconic for all of us, and thank you for taking the chance, you and Vince, to make me the first woman to cover the NFL when the credentials, with no irony, said no women or children in the press box.
And Leslie, you were the first woman ever in the sports department at the Globe.
Well, you know what, it was, I'm glad you had the foresight to hire Vince, but Vince, I don't even know exactly how you did come to the Globe.
Well, I came to the Globe in 1975. I was working at the Philadelphia Inquirer. I heard from Dave Smith. He was interested in hiring a new assistant sports editor. Tom Mulvoy, the man you mentioned, was moving over to the news side. I was interested. I'd seen the paper. We'd seen what Dave had done during the 1975 World Series and so forth. I went up, hired me. One of the luckiest things that ever happened to me. He was my mentor there for the next 3.5 years. I couldn't have had a better one. Dave was in the forefront of how sports editors and sports sections were changing in the 70s with ideas, planning, page presentation, quality writing, the sort of thing that had not gone on in the past. Sports editors were typically people who were maybe still writing columns, often still writing. Running the department was almost a sideline, and it kind of just happened day after day. Sometimes great things, but not with a lot of planning. Dave and a handful of others changed all that. When Dave went to the Washington Star, I became the sports editor in late 1978. I had the very good fortune of hiring Don Squire, who brought a fierce advocacy for journalism to the paper and a real flair for page presentation, something that was terrifically important as sections were evolving in the 70s. It was really a golden age of sports, I think, in Boston. In the 80s, Bird and the Celtics, Magic and the Lakers, one of the great rivalries of all time, 3 world championships. The Red Sox defined heartbreaking for their fans. They were always in it, but never quite win it. Epitomized by the ball going through Buckner's legs in 1986. The Bruins were often in the Stanley Cup finals. The Patriots, who had been the laughingstock of the league for many years, actually went to the Super Bowl in 1986. And the paper, under the Taylor family and Tom Winship, were enlightened. They made a lot of money in the paper in the 80s. They plowed most of it back into the paper, resources, manpower, space, unlimited travel, allowed us to cover all these stories. And of course, it wasn't just the great stories. There were some tragic stories too. The death of Len Bias, drafted first by the Celtics, died that night of a drug overdose. Totally unexpected story, tragic circumstances. Jackie McMullen, Bob Bryant did a great job of covering that story. And that 80s was just a terrific run for me. I left in 1989 to go to the National Sports Daily, which was a grand experiment. I went as executive editor with Frank DeFord as the editor-in-chief. We spent a lot of money, lasted about 16 months, went out of business. I went to work for ESPN. I was there for 23 years, primarily as a senior vice president of news. Was lucky enough to launch the studio components of ESPN2, ESPN News, ESPN Classic. I too am now retired and, like Dave, working on improving my handicap.
Well, Don, there's the handoff. You're still in the game.
Well, you know, I'm retired too, but I've got no chance at benefiting from anybody's handicap. I'm awful, so I don't think I'm ever going to get any better. But I took over for Vince in 1989, and just to set the table there, in 1986 at the World Series, there were people doing sidebars, and those are, and for those who don't know the word, sidebars are stories that are generally inside, generally shorter, but that are essential to kind of paint the picture of exactly what's happening in a game. we had doing sidebars, Leslie Visser, who ended up being a Hall of Fame writer, Jackie Mcmullen, Hall of Fame writer, Kevin DuPont, Hall of Fame writer. We had another guy named John Powers, who I don't know if he's in any Hall of Fame, but he won a Pulitzer. We had Ian Thompson doing sidebars, who probably was the best takeout writer that the Globe ever had. So I'm painting the picture of inheriting a staff of superstars. It was unbelievable, the amount of talent that existed at the Globe in the 80s. And all I had to do, I was a limo driver with the biggest limo in the world. All I had to do was keep it on the road. And so I tried to keep it on the road from 89 to 04. There were a couple of bumps and bruises along the way, I guess, but things worked out pretty well. I guess the highlights for my tenure included the Patriots' runs to the Super Bowl in 02 and 04, winning the Super Bowl in 02 and 04. There was the ownership of the Red Sox changing hands and the ownership of the Patriots changing hands, and also another death of Reggie Lewis that I think we did a pretty damn good job on, especially since it was very sudden, and we reacted very well to it. Oh yeah, I left out one guy, Steve Staineroo, who worked on that Reggie Lewis stuff. He won a Pulitzer too. So it's just a question of what I'm getting at is there was such a depth to the department by the time I inherited it. Dave was the architect. He was a brilliant architect who really set the stage for everybody in the years to come. And Vince carried it through like nobody could. And I left in 04. I went to ESPN to become the senior news editor for event production, which is where the games that they actually air take place. They wanted some editorial oversight, and I was the one who was to orchestrate that. I got 9 hires eventually that we rounded out our team on. I also oversaw the bureaus for a few years that included, I think, 40 reporters and producers covering all things throughout the country and really around the world. And then in 2012, I think I took over as a senior coordinating producer for Sports Center for the weekend mornings, I'm sorry. And then I left in 2016. I did a couple consultant things for some startups. And now when I'm not trying to improve my handicap, which I'm not going to be able to do, I am helping to take care of my 2 grandkids, which are the loves of my life right now. That's the labor of love, if ever there was one, Max and Ada. They're great little kids, and I have a good time taking care of them, or helping.
Sounds tremendous, and I'll never forget, I was as you said, I was one of your sidebar people, and I was going to get to do the Red Sox clubhouse, the celebration, and all I remember, I was heading down, and John Powers said, "Hold the elevator, Mitchell singled." It all unraveled. But you know what, Don, you're so right about the 27 Yankees that the Boston Globe writers have been. I mean, you mentioned a few of them, but 4 are in Cooperstown, 2 in the NBA, as you said, 2 in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, 2 in the hockey, and Bud Collins in the tennis. And so it's just been this, matter of fact, when CBS, they came to the Boston Globe to offer me a job in around 84. And I said, why would I leave the Globe? And they were like, what are you kidding? There are only 20 of these jobs. But it has been quite a run. And of course, Joe, you've been blessed to work with a lot of these people too.
It was, and very much like Don said, I inherited a great staff from him when I became sports editor in 2004. And my goal was just to maintain the Globe as one of the best sports sections in the country that was established by the 3 people you just heard first. And we tried our damnedest. But of course, what we were mostly busy with during my time was championships. This is the glory years of Boston sports. And in my time, there was 8 championships won by Boston teams. I was sports editor from 2004 to 2018. And it was an incredible experience to witness this happen. And we had to keep up. We had to produce great material, great sections, great photos. And it was a great challenge too, but I enjoyed it immensely and grateful for the opportunity. some of the things, and I can talk about it later, but the bigger stories we worked on, of course, had to do with the cheating Patriots. The Deflategate and Spygate were also propped up during these times. So it was the Patriots also at this time, and really at the end of Don's time, evolved from probably the least popular team in Boston to the most popular, which is where they remain at this time. And I am retired also, living in Weymouth, Massachusetts. And the only thing I still do Matt Pepin lets me do a little bit of writing about college basketball and horse racing. So that's what I do.
Well, those are, for people who don't know, those are our Jersey boys, Don and Joe.
Right.
Been so great for us. And one of the challenges, maybe, I think it came in probably with Don and Joe, but certainly with Matt, you had the challenges of the digital. You know, I think, Matt, you helped create or did create Boston.com that everybody in the country, around the world, reads. So can you talk about your years at the Globe?
Sure, and thank you for that nice introduction, Leslie, and for joining us on this panel today. Very much appreciate your presence here. I cannot take credit for Boston.com. It pre-existed me, but Joe did bring me in to be the digital sports editor starting in 2009, and so I was very fortunate to learn under Joe, who I think conveyed many of the principles all of his predecessors who are here with us today instilled in him. And I believe that there is a very strong thread running through the sports editor's office at the Globe, because Joe would talk a lot about what Don did and what Dave did and what Vince did and the lasting effects of those things. So I feel very fortunate to be the beneficiary of a lot of that wisdom. But at the same time, I felt like my role, you know, for the early on was obviously to focus on the developing of our digital business, and that, you know, started on Boston.com. We added a second website, BostonGlobe.com, and so I became sports editor of that. And then when Joe retired in 2018, I took over for him, and I really felt like, you know, my foundation previously was in print. I was sports editor at the New Haven Register and at the Times Herald Record in Middletown, New York, where that was my first real hybrid job of newspapers and digital. And I think that's what I brought to the table in replacing Joe, was having one person, you know, be in charge of both aspects of our business and bringing us into an age where we publish on even more than just those two platforms, more than print and more than just our website. We have newsletters, we run social media, all kinds of things like that. So it's really been a great opportunity career-wise for me to learn from everybody, and I hope to be able to continue what has started as a great legacy of great editors and great writers at the Globe, and, you know, continue to cover the championship pursuits and hopefully satisfy the fans for a long time to come.
It does. It's still such a comprehensive and well-written sports section. I'd like to ask something to start maybe with Vince, but then could you all just jump in whenever you have a feel for it, of how it's changed in the 50 years since you and Dave. Like, people always ask me and I say, you can't understand. There were glue pots and Nighthawks and pneumatic tubes. And, you know, back then, the least of it was the writing. The most of it were phone calls, confirming things, driving places, trying to get people on the phone, trying to get the important quote. And we love the writing, but now it's, you know, shifted to 24/7. The writers have to be able to pivot to so many different platforms. But Vince and Dave, Vince, would you start to share what it was like?
Well, I never had to send Will McDonough out with an iPhone to get video. And if that had happened, I'm not sure how it would have gone. Look, in a lot of ways, Joe and Matt have had much tougher jobs than myself, Dave, and Don, who kind of bridged that gap there and everything. You know, in the 80s, when I was sports editor, the Globe dominated Boston. It was the voice of the city. It was making a ton of money, was plowing that money back into the product. Everybody read the Globe, even people who didn't like the Globe read the Globe. You know, I mentioned earlier, and we were talking, this, you know, was right after busing, and the Globe had been a big advocate for busing, which was unpopular in a lot of quarters of Boston, particularly in South Boston and Dorchester, which is right where the Globe was located. can't tell you how many people I would run into in Boston that would say, I don't like the Globe, I don't like their politics, but I buy the paper anyhow to read sports. And there's no doubt that that was going on. So we were very lucky. You know, communication was, it's interesting now, I don't know how we existed without cell phones, but we did somehow. And, you know, things happened more slowly, obviously. You know, when, you know, I was at ESPN when really the Twitter revolution erupted there. There was resistance to it at first because it suddenly was the Wild West. Writers had the ability to simply put things out without vetting, without editing, and so forth. We tried to put restrictions on that at ESPN. It was an ongoing battle, still goes on today. But, you know, we had total control of the product in the 1980s. There were, you know, very few pipelines, a couple of big newspapers, a couple of TV stations in Boston and so forth. And you control the flow of information. There are good things about that and probably bad things about it. But, you know, for us, you know, we never had to worry about the resources very much. And I know for Matt and Joe, that's a paramount concern, that resources were dwindling, budgets were getting smaller, staffs were being cut. Dave and I never dealt with that. We were lucky enough to be there when everything was on the upswing. And that's probably the difference of the 70s and the 80s with the 21st century right now.
You know, it's interesting. Some of the people who are listening in right now might appreciate the fact that when in the 70s, a reporter, first of all, had to lug not only his paperwork, books and all that, but a typewriter to the press box. And then you'd have to have, and then you would literally be typing your story as things went along. Then you would hand a sheet of paper to a Western Union operator who would then send it to the office. And then a copy editor there would get this piece of paper, edit it, and then he would have to send it to the composing room where a linotype operated. This whole process. From that point to today where you literally type on your computer and it comes out on the press almost. I mean, it was an amazing 50 years of watching this happen. It's a sad 50 years to watch what's happened to newspapers overall. But as Vince said, from my whole career from 2000, or from, well, it's 40 some years. I guess in 2004, when I retired, it's kind of, to me, started the real demise of where daily papers were just kind of disappearing. Sad.
Joe, I think you had a thought?
Yeah, so when the Globe closed its Morrissey Boulevard offices and we moved downtown, there were filing cabinets filled with these calendar books, a day calendar. And pasted into the calendar books were box scores and standings every day from all the professional leagues. And the books went back to 1946. And there we were in 2016. What do we do with these? There's no room for them in downtown Boston. So thankfully, Richard Johnson, the curator of the Sports Museum in New England, took it off our hands, plus all the media guides. There were, I don't know, there had to be 50 filing cabinets filled with media guides where you would have every Patriots media guide from 1960 all the way up through 2016. And again, we thank Richard for taking them off our hands and preserving them, and they're now in a storeroom somewhere, at least available for someone if they needed it.
Yeah, it was such a different time, you know, and I remember the Patriots in '76, their press guide, they took the team photo the day that their two best players, John Hanna and Leon Gray, weren't there. So they took the picture anyway and put it in the press guide, little thing. But, you know, Don, you really saw the real pivot, didn't you, from print to digital?
Yeah. Yeah, I think what Dave and Vince were able to build on, I inherited that, but then somewhere, probably because of me, it started to dwindle by the time I left. I think it really had to do with the fact that people had a lot different ways now. Vince had mentioned the fact that the Globe was it. That was where people went to get their news and information. But by the time the late 90s had rolled around, people could get their information from other sources, from their computers, and they can get it much more quickly than we could deliver it in the morning on the doorsteps. And I think as a result of that, we started losing a little circulation. It didn't help either that Monster.com came along at a time when they were grabbing classified ads away from everybody, including the Globe. That really put a dent not only in the size of the paper and as a result less space, but also our budgets. Our budgets became smaller because we weren't making as much money. It made sense. And instead of having, like, I'm sure Vince can tell you that whenever there was an opening, and there were rarely openings at the Globe, they usually just added on people. But if there was an opening as a result of somebody leaving, you would get a hire. Well, that was the way for me in the early 90s and maybe mid 90s, but by the late 90s, early 2000s, it was more 2 for 1. You know, you lose 2 people, you might get 1 back. And you can see that the staff, I think the staff when I started out, I think we had 59 full-timers, and when I left there were 48 or 47. So we lost 12 people in the course of my 15 years. But really, I would venture to bet that most of those happened between 98 and 2004.
Yeah, that is so interesting, Don. And of course, Vince, you remember that we flew first class back from the ALCS, you know, from
Yes,
the
you did.
Angels. And, you know, I'm sure, Matt, are the budgets much different now, but you're demanding so much more?
Yeah, there's no doubt. We've had to refine the scope of our coverage without question. And you know, one of the advantages of the internet age is the ability to predict what readers will want and what they'll like. And so we use those metrics to make the coverage decisions as best we can and try and, you know, focus on the largest possible audiences.
Well, we can do that too. We had Will McDonough.
You know what was great about Will?
Just ask him.
I'm sure all you guys knew this, but of course, Will had the Rolodex of all time, right? I mean, he probably had Mick Jagger's number in there. And so remember when Will would leave the office, we'd all dive underneath Will's desk to steal from his Rolodex. It'd be like Jackie and Shaughnessy and all of us would be underneath there saying, oh, here's Pete Rozell's. But yeah, I think people cherish 2 things always about the Globe: the ability that everyone had sources, and also that we were storytellers. And, you know, I'd like to know maybe, yeah, Don or Vince, just anybody, Joe, address that how you combine that all these years.
Vince, go ahead. You're the kingpin of it.
Well, one thing I did want to say, by the way, because his name's been mentioned several times, Will McDonough, who is a person that can, you know, his role cannot be understated in the Globe. He was a unique person, broke every story out there. Here's a little story about him, and I would not recommend this as a role model for a young reporter necessarily, but it'll give you an idea of the power he wielded. And this was sometime in I think the mid 80s. It was the day before Christmas, and we had a young intern, a young woman from Harvard named Nell Scoville, who's gone on to a great career. She's been a showrunner for several network shows. She's the co-author of Sheryl Sandberg's bestseller, Lean In. And I had hired her from Harvard to work as an intern. She came in that day. There was hardly anybody in the office. It was early in the day. The desk wasn't in yet. Christmas Eve, nothing was going on. Mike Madden, columnist at the Globe that I'd hired from Providence, was in the office. Will was in the office. And Nell Scoville comes wandering in. And while she's in, she hears Willie get on the phone. And all of a sudden, he's screaming every expletive in the book, MF this, F that, C, A, you name the word, he was using, just lambasting whoever was on the other end of the phone. And Nell goes over to Mike Madden and says, my goodness, who's he talking to? And Mike said, oh, he's talking to Billy Sullivan, the owner of the Patriots. And Billy and Willie had a contentious relationship, as you all know. And Billy had dropped a story on somebody the day before that broke a story that Willie didn't get. Willie was not happy about it, And the day before Christmas, he picked up the phone and let Billy Sullivan know exactly how he felt. Again, not exactly what I would recommend for a young reporter, but this is the kind of power Willie wielded. And, you know, there was debate about, you know, the ethics of it from time to time and so forth, but nobody broke more stories, not only on his beat, on everybody else's beat too. He was plugged in all over the place. He had his favorites, without a doubt, but he knew how to get information. He was, you know, really the definitive South Boston product, you know, born and bred in Boston, involved in politics, just an unusual man, and one of really the great sports journalists of our era. So anyhow, is there another question in there somewhere?
Well, can anyone, I'd like to know, Don, then jump in. I'd like to know if anyone can confirm that Whitey Bulger was in disguise at Will's funeral. Anyone confirm?
I don't know if he was there, but there were a lot of people at that funeral, as you may recall. The viewing was held at Boston Garden, okay, a line wrapping around the thing. Billy Bulger, Whitey's brother, who had been the president of the city council in Boston and was later the chancellor of UMass, was in the first row of that funeral, passed out during the service. And
into Jackie. I think he passed out. Jackie was in the front row. Didn't he pass out?
Yeah.
He passed out. They took him out on a gurney, and even at Will McDonough's funeral, there was drama. You know, yes. So I mean that was Willie. He went out in style.
So a quick Will McDonough story. I'll try to make it very quick. I'm sure we all have ours. But this was at Barcelona in the Olympics in '92, and Lee Montville, probably the purest, most wonderful writer of anybody I've ever read, was there covering for Sports Illustrated in '92. And Will was there actually more for the NFL than for us with NBC, I think. Yeah, right, NBC. And they were on this, Sports Illustrated had rented a huge yacht to kind of wine and dine the elite. And Will and Lee from New Haven, Will from South Boston, are on this big, beautiful yacht. And Will is looking over the beautiful city of Barcelona in the harbor. And he turns to Lee and says, you know, sometimes being a sports writer really has its benefits. You know, you get to hobnob with the rich and famous. It's terrific. And Lee goes, yeah, you know, we're kind of lucky. Will says, we? What do you mean we? I'm talking about you. I am the rich and famous.
Yes.
That's so both of them. What was the story? Remember, tell Vince the story of Claiborne, of course, and Will having a physical fight in the locker room, and Lee said to find the third string tight end so he would not be involved.
Yeah, that story made Willie famous around the country. It was you know, of course, writers were always intimidated by athletes, and athletes often use that intimidation. Nobody intimidated Will McDonough, so he's in the Patriots locker room after a game, and Raymond Claiborne, who's an all-pro defensive back for the Patriots, comes walking by, and he sort of brushes Willie and gives him kind of a, get out of my way here. And Willie says, what? And, you know, a discussion starts, a lot of finger pointing and everything. Apparently, Claiborne pointed a finger and it jabbed Willie in the eye, whereupon Willie hit him. And as the reporting goes, Claiborne fell into a trash can. You know, that story only added, of course, to the McDonough legend. You know, after that, you know, he was not only this great journalist, he was the guy that punched out a pro football player too. So the legends around Will McDonough are endless.
You know, Joe, you were there for the final. Remember, Dan Chauncey wrote that great column about the last 59 years on Morrissey Boulevard and how it was our dugout. Can you talk about, and I guess to Matt, what it was like when you shifted to the new plant?
This might be disappointing because I am the least sentimental person there is.
Oh, that's because you're a degenerate gambler. You're a horse gambler.
I am that also.
Lynn Searson told me about you.
But I will say, I'll speak from the viewpoint of other people. There were a lot of people who were sad about the move from Morrissey Boulevard, the memories and the traditions that were part of that building. Dan Shaughnessy led the parade in being sad. You know, he was threatening to lock himself in his office and not leave until the wrecking ball came. But
some readers would have liked that, I think.
Yeah, they would have. You could have sold taking turns swinging the wrecking ball at Shaughnessy.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But you know, it's so there was great journalism practice there, great camaraderie that will never be forgotten. But you know, I don't mean to ruin it, Leslie. I just don't feel the pull the same way. I mean, I was there for 24 years, but I guess 22 years at Morrissey Boulevard. But I'm just not sentimental.
I guess maybe this would be more the end of you and to Matt, but what I was thinking of was, of course, everyone thinks PTI, but the original PTI were Gammons and Ryan going at it every single day. Who sweats more, Moses Malone? No, Wes Unseld. You know, no matter what the topic was, they were the original, which of course, Dave, and you had both their notes column. But that's, I think, maybe is missing. I mean, Dave, don't you remember that people were smoking? There was the clacking of the Royal typewriters.
Oh, yeah. Not only that, but, you know, there was something about it that the writers wanted to come in the office.
Right.
Spent time with, and that was the fun part. It was like the only thing we didn't have was beer. It was great. I mean, the battles went on.
Yes, we did.
And for fun, the battle, I mean, it wasn't like there was any animosity, but
Gammons and Ryan made so much noise in that department. I mean, there's a well-known story there one day. They're yelling back and forth across the sports department about something. Who knows what it was, innocuous. Also in the room at that time was the old hockey writer, Tom Fitzgerald, who was, for those of you who remember him, a very straight-laced older gentleman, always showed up in a coat and tie. He was really an old-school guy, quiet, went about his business. He's in there writing a story. Gammons and Ryan are going back and forth, yelling, screaming, and so forth. Finally, Tom Fitzgerald walks over to them and says, "Excuse me, is my typing bothering you?" Yeah, that was sort of typical of what went on in the place.
He was our Jimmy Cannon. But you know, you guys, you thought big and you put out big sections, and you know, we're known for the championship coverage and the takeouts and the, you know, some people don't know though, you know, some of the assignments you gave me, Vince, which I guess, you know, helped launch my career. For a while, I was your sort of George Plimpton, and I would have to do these first-person stories. And I recall that you had me go hang gliding until I broke my collarbone. And then, let me see, there was the time for people who don't remember orienteering. That's where they would send you into the woods for 3 days with a compass and a spoon, which my husband said sounded like Army Ranger training that he did at Fort Benning. But after 3 days, Vince did send police out to find the woods. So I guess that I have, you know, wonderful memories. Joe, I'm sure you assigned some people to go to what, Exarban to do a story?
The one first person story that comes to mind is Shearer Springer, a very smart reporter we had who now works for WBUR, played soccer golf. We sent her out to do that, where you actually kick a ball with the holes are big enough for a soccer ball, and she played that. I'm not sure that ended up being a great story. She did her best.
One thing that you mentioned and Joe mentioned and that we're talking about now is camaraderie. I'm telling you, I think that's what really made the section what it was in the, I can speak for the 80s and 90s. I was there from 79 to 89 under Vince. And while there was a lot of debates and a lot of stuff going on, but there was a real, I think, a sense of purpose. You know, the section was tremendous, and the people there wanted to prove how tremendous it could be virtually every day. And I'm no Pollyanna type. Joe can tell you that. I'm just dealing with facts. That's the way it was. And I really think that had a lot to do with how great the Globe was, that there was a feeling of camaraderie, of togetherness, not kumbaya kind of togetherness, not Pollyanna type, but just like, you know, we've got a purpose here, and let's do what we need to do to get this product out to people and show how good it can be. And I really think that helped propel the section from Dave, you know, Dave letting the writers write notes ad infinitum, really, on Sunday. Nobody else was doing that. And at least not that I know of. I'm going to say it just because it sounds good. And, you know, that created a sense that writers felt that it definitely was a writer's paper, a writer's section. And I think writers really felt that they could write the way they wanted to write within reason, and that they could express themselves maybe at length. There was a story that John Powers did in, oh God, I'm going to say 1980 on Danny Thomas. Joe, I don't know, Vince, I don't know if you remember the story.
I well remember. Danny, we hardly knew you.
Yes, that was the headline. That
Headline
ended
by
up
Al
on
Rudnick,
it.
by the way.
Yeah. Danny, we hardly knew you. Al Rudnick was a great copy editor for us. And it ran, and I guess in today's parlance, it would be at least 12,000 words. I think it still holds the record for the longest story ever. But the story was so good. It was. I remember going into Vince, because I was in charge of the story at the time. And I said, Vince, this is like a really good story. He goes, yeah, it's good. And I said, yeah, but it's really long. He said, oh yeah, how long? And I told him how long, and he went, really? He said, is it really that good? I said, yeah. I said, I really think we should try to get it in. It's going to mean we're going to have to kill like at least a couple, maybe a couple. We jumped the story, which means it went from the front page to the inside pages 3 times. And I told Vince that that's what it would take, and he said, go ahead, do it. And that's the way it was. I mean, it wasn't like, wait a minute, we have a limit here on it wasn't that. It was go ahead and do it. And I think that was pervasive, and I think it continued throughout the 80s, and I tried to keep it going in the 90s as well. By 2000, I'm sure things got tighter. It was not quite as loosey-goosey as it was in the 80s, but that was the pervasive attitude.
Were you ever nervous? Oh, go ahead. No, Matt.
I just wanted to add one quick thing to that, Leslie, is that I can tell you that I think that spirit of camaraderie still exists today. You know, whenever there's breaking news, Mookie Betts gets traded or anything, my phone lights up. Writers are, Pep, how can I help? What can I do? What do we need? You know, what's our plan? And people are checking in right away, and they check with their colleagues. And the best little example I can give you to explain, I think, sort of the spirit that exists in the Globe is I used to, when we were on Morrissey Boulevard, I would come in real early as the digital sports editor. And, you know, sometimes Dan Shaughnessy might be the first one to come in, and I'd be there, and there'd be a Nighthawk on the desk, you know, one of our editorial assistants, just a college kid who's answering the phones and doing stuff. And he'd always come over to me and say, Pep, what's that guy's name over there? And I'd tell him, oh, that's Brandon, or that's Jake, or whoever. And he'd go over and address them by name and say, hey, you know, I'm working on something. Could you look up these stats? Or could you go down to the library and get me this or something? This little task and greeting them by name. And I think, you know, for them to see a guy like Dan come to them and acknowledge them, you know, it's made them feel like, hey, I'm part of this bigger thing. And, you know, I like to think that probably had a lot of sway in a certain number of journalism careers.
I just want to say that I agree with what both of those guys said, but I think a lot of the pride also emanated from the copy desk, that they had a great pride in making those sections read good, look good, and guys like Ken Freitas especially is what I remember, one of the assistant sports editors that worked with Don.
Remember for Dave and Vince and Don, he might have hit your time too, but remember the guys would sit around the desk and they would invariably yell every 10 minutes, worst night ever.
Yeah. That continued.
That happened Sunday.
Glad to see the tradition is carried on. Yeah.
Can each of you talk about what it was like? I think, Matt, you had the 18-inning World Series game. Like, what's that like when the deadline really is passed, and maybe how you all handled that?
Sure. The 18-inning game of the World Series was one of the most memorable nights of my career, without question, because, you know, we missed the print deadline by a mile, but we were fortunate. One of our senior assistant was able to, Greg Lang was able to call the press people, and we were able to finally get a little bit of, I think we made 5,000 editions with that 18-inning game story. And I'll never forget staying up all night, and myself and Rachel Bowers, who was our assistant sports editor in charge of the web at the time, you know, up all night just wondering when this is going to end, when this is going to end. But we stayed with it because at the very least we had the online platforms that we could deliver news to. But between myself and Rachel and Jim Hoban, our nighttime sports editor, you know, we stayed and went the distance, and it was just unbelievable. And of course, many people have seen the famous quote from Nick Cafardo, who sometime around the start of the 17th or 18th inning turned to his colleagues in the press box and just said, "Isn't this great?" And, you know, God rest Nick's soul, he was such a great writer. But it really summed up sort of like the spirit of it for us all, that, you know, yeah, we blew deadline by a mile, and God only knows how many papers that was going to make. But we stayed with it, and I think, you know, no one wanted to give up on that, and so it was just unbelievably memorable.
It really, yeah, it was. Can maybe Don and Vince, before the digital age, or Dave, who did you have to beg? Did we need a little more time? The games, you know, I don't know.
Well, the story, of course, which is the definitive story of this, was 1986, Game 6, when the ball went through Buckner's legs, and that was, you know, we had probably, and Don, I was down there at Shea Stadium. Don was running the operation back in the office, and Don, you can fill in any blanks here, obviously, but we probably had 20 plus writers down there writing on deadline, and not just sports writers. News side was there, the living department was there, business was there, everybody, you know, general columnists were there. Anybody who wanted to write something in the Globe was there.
Boris Kern's good one.
They were all there, you know. And there were another 6 to 8 photographers, you know, and so forth. Probably 30 people all told. And we're heading towards a very late deadline here, obviously. The game is running on towards midnight. We've blown past the first deadline now, obviously. And now we're talking about a paper that's going to go out at some point. And it's going to go to a lot of people, okay, with, you know, not a very complete report, probably. But we're getting down to short strokes now. It looks like, you know, the Red Sox have finally ended this, I guess, about 60-year curse at that time and so forth. They're going to win this game. In fact, for those of us who were down here, remember the Mets actually inadvertently flashed a "Congratulations, Red Sox" on the scoreboard there that they had prepared to go, and someone pushed a button erroneously, you know, and everybody had written sidebars, columns, game stories, running efforts, not even talking to anybody. We had 20 stories ready to go. You know, Don's trying to put the paper out back in Boston and so forth. You know, they're yelling down to me. They're holding the presses. Hurry up. We got to get out. They're going to miss the trucks. They're going to miss the airplanes. We're not going to put a paper out without a final score in it, but we're just about ready to go. We've got a lot of copy in already, obviously, and so forth. And then the ball goes through Buckner's legs at about midnight. And all of a sudden, everything is changed. And, you know, I'm on 3 or 4 phones to guys in 2 auxiliary press boxes, the main press box. Change your sidebar. You're going to do this. You know, Ian Thompson tells his famous story, which I don't believe was true, but he says, I came barging into the press box where he was and said, "You're doing John McNamara. He's a genius. He's delivered the first world championship to Boston." He says, 2 seconds later, I come running into the press box. "You're doing McNamara. He's a moron. He left Buckner in the game." You know? So this is what was going on. And, you know, that night ended, you know, we talked about, Dave mentioned the typewriters we were carrying. This was right at the edge of the beginning of the digital era, when those of you who know, remember there were the teleports, the telecopiers, you remember, 25 digital machines. People would type their stories on these, but then you had to call the office, get the phone, and plug it into 2 ear holes, which is how the story was transmitted. And Montville's writing his column, and I'm with him, and the telecopier, for some reason, is under the table now, plugged into a phone, but the connection is bad. They're not getting a good reception. And the only way they can get reception is if somebody actually sits on the phone and holds it down in there. So that's what the sports editor of the Boston Globe was doing at about 1 o'clock in the morning to get Montville's column into the Globe. To me, that's the definitive deadline story, okay?
Joe, did you have experiences like that in the ALCS in 2003, where it looked like it was over? People are writing it's over. Again, the history of the Red Sox.
Nothing like that. That's going to be hard to top. But certainly, we did think it was over until the Red Sox won Game 4. But it was. I guess just less dramatic than that. I mean, nothing can compare to that. And I would have been a good candidate to sit on the phone for so I
No,
carry a lot
I
of
wasn't a
weight.
good candidate either, but necessity makes strange bedfellows.
What goes in, Don? You started, what goes into preparing the section for a championship? What does that all entail?
Well, for me, when Vince left in '89, he didn't really leave me much guidance. Like he just said, here, look at the budgets, take a look, and you figure it out. But what he did leave, he didn't know it, but what he did leave was the outline for one of the championship series that were going, might have been in '86, in fact, and I held on to it, and I just stole it. I mean, I just used that as my outline for how to prepare for a major event. You have to get out way in front of it. You have to let people know what's going on. Nothing is too minute to detail. I actually would say, listen, you can probably, I was also into trying to save some money for our budget. So I tell them, make sure you try to get the flights ahead of time and we can cancel them, because we had our own travel agency at that time, the Globe did. And I said, we can just cancel them and it won't cost us anything, but if we get out ahead of it. So there was a lot of pre-planning going on that I think ended up yielding positive results when the team did keep going, because the writers and the desk and everybody and I would know what we had to do. It was outlined there for us, and we could actually get out ahead of it. So nothing beats planning, and Vince was a master at it, and Dave was too. And I think the groundwork that they laid for everybody really is what carried me through for the 15 years. That's for sure.
Well, Dave started the planning memo. Okay, that's where it all began. And modestly, I would say I enhanced the memo after he left. Okay, they did become monsters. Okay, in fact, these were planning memos for big events, planning memos for special sections, and so forth. And they were pretty much of a joke within the department. Like, people would get them, and they'd show them to other writers around the country and say, "Look, can you believe this guy? He's writing the stories here before they even happen and everything. Can you believe this detail and so forth?" And look, we were flexible enough to change the detail as the circumstances dictated and so forth. But I did believe it was important, and I know Dave believed it initially. He really instilled it in me, and Don continued it, that if you had a plan, you were ready to go. You might have to change that plan. You might have to massage it a little bit, take it in a slightly different direction, or the ball might go through Buckner's legs. But planning memos were an important component of where the Globe was going in those days.
I would just say, Leslie, I continued it, maybe not to the detail that Don had. And we also, and Matt after me, have to incorporate the internet into it, the web presentation. But I will say this, I was at a Super Bowl, and a former Globie came up to me with the organization he was working with, and I was holding our planning memo, and he goes, "God, I missed that. I wish we had that."
Yeah, it's like sometimes people think, oh, you go to the game and then the paper out. But can each of you talk? So many of the people watching this, they feel like they know Lee Montville so well. They loved Ray Fitzgerald. They know Peter and Dan and Bob and Jackie. Can each of you talk about the staff you had and what their writing styles were?
That's a hard question. I mean, Lee Montville, who's probably my best friend in the world. I mean, he was such a wonderful writer. He wasn't the typical columnist who campaigned for something argumentative. The word that comes to mind currently, of course, is hot takes, and so forth. Montville wrote little parables. He wrote stories, and the stories reflected what he was thinking, but you had to pay attention to them. And he just had a wonderful, wonderful way with words. He wrote a column, and sometimes he had the time to do this. When I got to the Globe, as Dave knows, Lee was writing the afternoon columns, writing for the afternoon paper. Gave him a lot of time to write after events. I eventually, when I got in there, moved into the morning paper just because we were selling so many more morning papers, and it just seemed to me we had to get Lee Montville's voice in there. And so, you know, he wrote a column off of John Havlicek's last game, and he had the luxury of staying until John Havlicek and Lee Montville were the last two guys in the locker room at the Boston Garden. And Havlicek actually went around turning out the lights in the locker room, you know, before he left his final game he ever played. And Montville just, you know, was an observer to all this and chronicled it. And he did it in wonderful fashion. And that column just always sticks with me. Ray Fitzgerald had some of the same qualities. You know, Ray died much too young in his 50s. When he passed away, it was hard to believe the number of readers we heard from who recalled specific columns that Ray had written and wanted to see them reprinted. One particularly was one where Ray had been rummaging around in a closet and had found his old baseball glove. And he wrote about it and about the memories it evoked and so forth. And, you know, that column stuck with people. I mean, literally hundreds of people asked for that column to be reprinted, which we did, you know, upon Ray's death. So, you know, they were two special people. And, you know, I mean, I could go on with the same kind of story, but I'll let others talk about it with Peter and Bob and so forth.
But, you know, Vince, of course, here's the old curmudgeon speaking again. But I think the difference back then and today is because of what the internet's caused today, where, you know,
yes,
to be almost nasty, they think, you know, sometimes they've got to go after. I remember Ray Fitzgerald one time, I can't remember what the issue was with one of the coaches and whether he should be fired or not. And I sat down with Ray and I said, Ray, you got to write this, and you got to, you know, you've just got to demand that they, you know, make this move. And Ray looked at me and he said, you know, if somebody's going to write a column saying I should be fired, I would. I mean, he said, that's my livelihood. And he said, that's not my job. I'll write, and I'll write the situation, but I am not going to ever write that somebody should lose their job or it should impact a person's life in that way. And that was Ray. But the difference is back then, most of the writers were writers. And I mean, you know, they reported news very well. But it was always balanced. I think that's the difference today as to some of these young writers today compared to then, and to the media itself today. I mean, back then it was a very balanced coverage.
Yeah, it's Vince alluded to this before, that people always say, well, what is it about the Globe? Writers always say to me, oh, he wrote. And I always say, well, Boston, I think, had three elements to it. We care about three things in Boston: politics, sports, and talking, arguing, debating. We are a verbal city, and that amalgam through the train from that pulls through Dave from you to Matt, I think all the writers were interested in everything, not just in a box score.
You know, someone asked us when we were preparing for this about the metrics that Dave and I used, as opposed to, you know, what's going on right now where you've got, you know, digital traffic, hits, and so forth. You've got very, very definitive measurements of who's reading, what they're reading and what they aren't reading and so forth. We didn't have that. I mean, our metrics were basically circulation, which we couldn't directly tie to the specific writer or something, advertising certainly, and purchasing the paper. I mean, those, I don't know if I'm missing anything, Dave, but those were basically the metrics that we operated by. And you never really knew if people were really reading this particular writer or not. And maybe it's better now that you can measure those things, but it does impact decisions, I think, in ways that are not always beneficial. And, you know, we were lucky at the Globe. My theory always was that more often than not, people read the sports section to read Peter Gammons on the Red Sox, Bob Ryan on the Celtics, Will McDonough on the Patriots and the NFL. That's was the biggest attraction. But we could afford to, you know, run all of that material, and yet we had the space to run large feature takeouts, enterprise reporting, investigative series, and so forth. You know, let a Lee Montville ruminate in his very unique manner, or Ray Fitzgerald. And maybe not as many people were reading that material as were reading Gammons on the Red Sox, Ryan on the Celtics and everything, but it did give the paper that balance that was alluded to here and so forth. And I think it made it a really quality product. And for people that appreciated quality writing like that, it was a special publication.
I'd periodically have a call from a reader who would say we gave Gammons a couple days off. Somebody else filled in. I'd get a call. Where's Peter Gammons? Why isn't he covering the Red Sox today? Literally, you're right. People followed the writers.
They, of course, this was, before the internet and everything existed. Everybody knew about Peter Gammons' Sunday baseball column, but not that many people could read it. If you were someplace else, maybe you could get out-of-town papers or something. And over time, I built up a coterie of, maybe 75 to 100 people who I would mail Peter Gammons' Sunday column to. They wanted to read it, and this was the only way they were going to get it. And that was something we did. Again, these were other journalists, primarily people who I knew, people who'd asked me to do it. It wasn't a general service that the Globe provided. If you wanted to buy a subscription, they'd mail you a newspaper and so forth. But these were people, often in the business or around the business that simply wanted to read Peter Gammons. This is the only way they could get it. So, it was
but they were very, everyone was so well-rounded. I remember Dave going into when I first got the job and said, what can I do to just really be the best I can be at this? And you gave me one sentence. You said, read everything, read books, read editorials, read every section of the paper. And I remember, Peter Gammons would take me to hear Bonnie Raitt or Patti Smith in Cambridge coffee houses, or, we had friends, lawyer friends, all kinds of people that were in our group, but outside just sports. And I think that made for meaningful writing.
Peter Gammons was the master of the historical and pop culture reference, as we all know. Sometimes to the fine point of no one knew what he was talking about. But he was the master of it. And, he coined, Old Town Team was Peter Gammons. The Calvinist winds of doubt that swept the Red Sox was Peter Gammons, granted, and people would say to me sometimes, well, a lot of people don't understand that. Why don't you take it out? My answer was always, to me, it's so good that if only 10% of the people understand it, I'm leaving it in. And maybe that wasn't the best editing decision. I don't know, but to me, it was the right one.
Did you, even Joe, in your time, and Don, did you want different personalities? Some teams don't want a lot of different personalities on the team in crunch time, but were you glad for the variables of the personalities at the Globe?
Of the staff, you mean?
Yes.
Don, I'm waiting for you to talk.
Oh, I thought Leslie wanted you to talk. I'm happy to jump in. Unfortunately, when Vince left, that was bad enough, but Lee left the same year. And so
almost the same
there was
time.
a columnist spot that, what's that? Yeah, same time.
Almost the same time we both left, yeah.
Right, and so there was a columnist spot to fill, and that's when the Globe gave me two columnist spots which was about right. If Lee left, two people were going to have to fill the spot. But I ended up going with Dan and Bob Ryan as columnists, and I don't regret it for a second. I think they brought a passion to their points of view. They could be velvet hammers, or often they could be just plain hammers, especially Dan. But I think that they could always be counted on to write what they felt, and they wrote it brilliantly. And later we had people like, obviously McDonough was there forever, so he was the best that you could ever have in terms of reporting and knowledge and getting it to the readers. But Jackie Mcmullen filled in as a columnist in the late 90s, and Phil Lynch, he became a columnist in the late 90s. Michael Holley was a columnist for us in the 90s, a terrific writer. So we had a lot of people who could write really well, kind of approach parables, but not quite. maybe to the tune of Montville, but I think that's reaching for the heavens. They were all terrific in their own way, and really, one thing that I really wanted to make sure we always had was a columnist on the front page of the sports section, no matter what. I don't care what day it was. I don't care how many great games we had going on. We had to have a column on the front page and a feature, because I thought the mix was important to have the hard news with some either reflection of what was going on in that one of those games, or maybe something entirely different. And of course, a feature that could be the surprise element, something that people weren't really expecting to get, but they could expect the unexpected.
And I would just add, Leslie, that when you use the term diversity, it applies universally on your staff. You're a better staff, a more complete staff with different types of people. And we're talking about age, gender, personality, all of that. When you have the right mix, that's the best staff to have.
Yeah, thanks. Always has been, back to Larry Whiteside was there when I started. You've all of you have always been so inclusive. The women have been fantastic. And, I am enormously proud myself to have been a soldier with the Boston Globe. But we're about to kind of wrap it up. Would each of you just have a closing thought, maybe what you're most proud of that you saw in the Globe or you still see in the Globe? Dave?
Well, I think it still stands out as one of the great newspapers of all time, and that hasn't changed over all these years. And, I was just thrilled to be a little part of it in the beginning.
Not little. Vince?
Well, it's hard to name any one thing, but I am quite taken with the thread that exists of the 5 people on this Zoom conference here. This runs back to 50 years of the Globe Sports section. There's a continuity there. One person hired another, was succeeded by that person that they hired. I think there's a common thread in the thinking that has gone through that 50 years. To think that only 5 people have, guided the sports department through those 50 years, those long 50 years is quite a thing. And I don't know really what it speaks to, but I'm very proud to be a part of it.
Well, it has been the sort of ultimate Olympic relay, and you to Don, what are your thoughts?
I'm kind of thought out, but I think
you can't opt out.
The common thread, I think, running through every one of these sports editors here, and really everybody on the staff inside and out, was something I mentioned before, and that was a resolve. I really think that there was a resolve. Listen, there were other newspaper people and other newspapers that I rubbed elbows with. There wasn't nearly that kind of resolve that there was at the Globe, and I'm not really sure why. When I came from the Boston Herald, which was a great place to come from. I'm not disparaging it at all. That's where I really noticed. I worked in New Jersey before that. I really noticed like the pride everybody took in their product. And when I went from the Herald to the Globe, there was just so many more people there that I was really like overwhelmed and determined to try to make sure that I put everything into the work that I could do and that I could make the product a little bit better. And I don't think that ever wavered for the 25 years I was at the Globe. I know that, when Joe took over for me, I know that was his drive, that's what he was trying to keep going. And I know that he did.
Yeah, everyone really kept the standard up. And Joe, did you think, okay, I've been here as an assistant, but now, and here comes the Red Sox first World Series. Did you think there is a standard to uphold?
Absolutely, but mostly I'm stunned that Don said something nice about me.
I know. It's a one-off.
A moment of weakness.
For all those people who don't know us, Don and I are best of friends, and we like to tease each other. This is the only thing I've done in my life is sports journalism. I started in this business when I was 18 years old, and I came to the Globe when I was 42. So at some point you realize maybe you're not going to get to one of the best places to do what you do for a living. And I was lucky enough to do that. And I just take great pride and feel very lucky to have had my 24 years at the Globe.
And Matt, you've seen thread that pulls so proudly through. We'll leave you with a closing thought.
Yeah, thank you. I'm incredibly proud of the legacy and incredibly proud to be part of the the Globe family through the years. And the one thing, and I'll answer at least one reader question or viewer question that we got was, one thing I'm really proud of is during this pandemic, I've been asked 100 times, millions of times, about how did we fill the sports section without any games? And quite honestly, it really wasn't a problem at all. When I could sense that this was coming, that a shutdown was on the horizon, I put out the call to our incredibly great writing staff and our incredibly great copy desk. They're all multi-platform editors now. They work on print, they work on online, and it's an incredible team. They sent me 11 pages worth of ideas, and we had no problem filling up the website with news of the pandemic, with our print pages, with all kinds of really, really creative and great features. And the absence of the games let us really focus on that creativity. And it's something that even now that as things are resuming and, very busy night, the Bruins are dropping the puck any minute now. We're going to continue as much as possible to, to encourage that creativity and find time for the writers to break away so that they can do this. And it's something that our multi-platform editors have participated in as well. They've written for us during this time. They've taken on assignments out of the norm, and it's what the Globe does.
It does. It's working as hard as you can is the minimum always at the Boston Globe. And thank you, Matt, for putting this together. And to all the subscribers, we're going to do this again soon when we will have a chance to take your questions, but this is the first time all these men have been assembled, and I guess we had a lot to cover, but thank you all, and promise all you guys will do it again.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you all.
Leslie.